Imagine a being once revered among angels, hailed as the epitome of grace and power. But how did this figure fall from such divine heights to become a symbol of betrayal and arrogance? What led to the tragic downfall of this once illustrious being? IAS was once a devoted worshiper, a figure of pure reverence, who stood among the highest ranks of the heavenly hosts. He was elevated above many, admired for his beauty and wisdom. But as he basked in this glory, a dark seed of arrogance began to grow within him. The more praise he received, the more his heart swelled with self-importance. He reveled in his elevated position, feeling entitled to even more. In his mind, he was no longer just a servant to the divine, but a being deserving of equal honor. This pride, once small and unnoticed, transformed into a towering force, blinding him to the truth of his existence. He began to believe that his brilliance surpassed even that of his creator, and it was this very arrogance that set the stage for his tragic fall. In the beginning, Allah created Adam, the first human, formed from clay. His creation, a sign of divine wisdom and mercy. Allah breathed His spirit into Adam, shaping him with care and purpose. He was made in the image of Allah's design, a being with free will, knowledge, and a connection to the divine. Upon the completion of Adam's creation, Allah commanded all the angels and the beings in the heavens to bow down in reverence to the new creation. This was a moment of divine instruction, a command that held both respect and meaning. It was a sign of recognition for Adam's unique place in the grand scheme of Allah's creation. The heavens trembled with the weight of the command, and every angel, every celestial being in Allah's domain, bowed in full submission, their loyalty and devotion evident in their obedience. They accepted Allah's will without question, humbling themselves in a display of unwavering faith. But there was one being who stood apart from the rest, IAS. IAS, once a high-ranking angel, felt the weight of the command, but refused to bow. His refusal was not born of ignorance, but of deep-seated arrogance. He stood tall, defiant in the face of Allah's will. His mind raced with thoughts of superiority. He had reasoned that, being created from fire, a substance far more noble, more powerful, and more radiant than clay, he was above such a gesture of submission. The very idea that he, the exalted IAS, should bow before a being made of mere clay was inconceivable to him. In his arrogance, IAS believed that his essence, his fire, was a creation of a higher and more refined substance, more worthy of reverence than Adam's humble clay form. He saw himself as superior to Adam, and even to Allah's command. His refusal wasn't just a denial of an act. It was an open declaration of his own inflated sense of importance. He argued, "I am better than him. I am made from fire, and he is made from clay. Why should I bow down to him?" The defiance of IAS was more than a simple act of disobedience. It was a betrayal of the very nature of submission to Allah. His pride, deeply rooted in his heart, spilled over into his every action, and it was at this moment that his arrogance was exposed in full light. His failure to bow was not a trivial act. It was a rejection of Allah's authority, a refusal to acknowledge the divine wisdom that lay behind his command. In that moment, IAS revealed his true nature, one driven by arrogance and self-righteousness. He saw himself as above the order of creation, above the wisdom of Allah. His defiance was not just a mistake or a moment of weakness. It was a deliberate choice, a choice to assert his own will over the will of the Creator. This moment marked the beginning of IAS's fall from grace. There was no turning back now. His refusal to bow was not just an act of disobedience. It was the ultimate expression of pride, the kind of pride that blinds one to the truth. It was a pride so powerful that it led him to deny the fundamental truth that Allah alone is worthy of worship and submission. In rejecting the command to bow, Iblis had sealed his fate. He had moved beyond the point of redemption, for his arrogance had eclipsed all reason and humility. From that point on, Iblis's fate was set. The path of pride had led him to a place where there was no return. His defiance of Allah was not a simple moment of disobedience. It was the defining moment that would forever change his existence. The moment of pride, the moment of refusal, was the moment when he fell from grace, and the consequences of that choice would echo through eternity. The moment Iblis's refusal to bow was met with the judgment of Allah. The heavens trembled with the weight of his fall. Allah's decree was swift and unyielding, as his divine justice demanded that Iblis be cast out from the realm of mercy. His arrogance and pride, once hidden beneath the surface, now laid bare for all to see, and the consequences of his defiance were immediate and irreversible. He had defiled the sanctity of submission, rejected the Creator's will, and placed himself above the very essence of humility and worship that every celestial being adhered to. Iblis, the once glorious being, now stood in the face of eternal damnation. As Allah's decree was pronounced, Iblis felt the weight of his actions crashing upon him like a tidal wave. It was not simply the loss of status or position that struck him. It was the loss of Allah's favor, the loss of the mercy he had once known so intimately. He had been cast out, not just from a place of honor, but from the divine presence itself. A void, cold and all-encompassing, swallowed him whole. The warmth of Allah's grace was gone, and in its place was a deep, gnawing emptiness that tore at the very fabric of his being. In that moment of utter despair, the being who had once stood tall among the heavens found himself consumed by a fury unlike any he had ever known. His mind raced, filled with thoughts of vengeance and bitterness. He could not accept it. The humiliation, the rejection, it all burned like a fire inside him. How could he, the noble Iblis, be cast aside so easily, so ruthlessly? The very thought of his disgrace was unbearable. His once proud heart, which had been full of arrogance and self-assuredness, now thudded with the bitter rhythm of defeat and resentment. His fury rose to a fever pitch, a boiling cauldron of rage and disbelief. The angels who had once stood by his side, the very beings he had thought of as his peers, now appeared to him as distant strangers. They had obeyed the command of Allah, bowed to Adam, and remained in the light of his mercy. But Iblis had rejected the command, and in doing so, he had made himself an enemy of Allah. There was no returning from this. The truth of his fall was undeniable, and the bitterness of that truth twisted his heart further into rage. But in his fury, Iblis did not resign himself to his fate. No, he could not accept it. He could not face the truth that his pride had led to his downfall without seeking a way to challenge it, to defy it. And so, in his desperation, Iblis turned to Allah. His voice, filled with both anger and anguish, rang out, pleading for something, anything, that could give him a glimmer of hope. "Grant me respite," he cried out, his voice raw with the pain of his defeat. "Give me time. Delay my punishment until the day of judgment. Let me prove myself. Let me show you that I am not a mere creation to be cast aside." Iblis's words were desperate, tinged with both fury and disbelief. He could not bear the thought of his disgrace being final. There had to be a way to redeem himself, to regain the place he once held, even if it meant defying the very will of Allah. His heart burned with a singular vengeful thought. He would not be forgotten. his pride would not be crushed so easily. And then, in his desperation, IAS made a vow that would echo through eternity. "I swear by all that I am," he declared, his voice full of venom and hatred. "I will prove that humanity is unworthy. I will lead them astray, away from the path of righteousness, and show Allah that His creation is nothing but flawed. I will make them doubt, make them falter, and I will lead them to ruin. I will make sure they do not fulfill the purpose for which they were created." With that, IAS swore to lead mankind astray, to corrupt their hearts, to twist their minds until they fell into the same arrogance and pride that had consumed him. He would stop at nothing to fulfill his oath, to seek vengeance for his fall from grace. His rage was now boundless, and his heart was consumed with a singular goal: to make humanity pay for the fate that had befallen him. His plea for delay was granted, but not out of mercy. Allah, in His infinite wisdom, allowed IAS to carry out his vengeance, to test the resolve of humankind, to give them the opportunity to choose between righteousness and corruption. But IAS had no understanding of the mercy behind this delay. In his blinded rage, he saw it only as a chance to destroy. And so, with the fire of vengeance burning within him, IAS was cast away into the abyss, but not before making his oath to lead humanity astray. From that moment forward, his every action, every whisper, would be aimed at luring mankind into the same trap of arrogance and rebellion that had led to his own downfall. His fury would know no end, and his mission would never waver: to ensure that humanity, the creation Allah had honored, would fall just as he had. In his heart, he believed that through his actions, he would find redemption, not in the eyes of Allah, but in his own twisted belief that he was proving a point. And so began the tragic journey of IAS, a being consumed by pride and fury, a being whose fall from grace would echo through the ages as a warning to all who would dare to let their arrogance blind them to the will of Allah. For millennia, IAS had existed in a state of fury and vengeance, driven by his oath to lead mankind astray, to corrupt their souls and make them fall into the same arrogance that had caused his own downfall. Over the endless ages, he had watched as countless souls passed through the threshold of life, some righteous and others lost in darkness. He had seen them fall to temptation, led astray by his whispers, their hearts twisted by pride and desire. Others had stood firm, resisting his every effort, their faith shining like a beacon in the darkness. Yet, no matter how many souls he turned away from righteousness, no matter how deeply he buried his fury in his work, there was one truth that even IAS could not escape: the inevitable passage of time, the irreversible fate that awaited all beings, whether they were humans, angels, or even fallen ones like himself. Now, the end was drawing near. IAS had long been aware of the progression of time, the steady march of moments and centuries that led all things toward their inevitable conclusion. The world he once sought to control, the people he had tried to corrupt, had continued to live and die in the eternal cycle of life. And now, as he watched from the shadows, his gaze fell upon the countless souls leaving this world. There was a shift in the air, an unsettling stillness that hung heavy around him. The souls were departing, one after another, their forms slipping away from the realm of the living and into the unknown. Some left with grace, ascending to their rightful places, while others were consumed by darkness, dragged away by the weight of their sins. The scale of existence seemed to tremble as millions passed, the quiet hum of the universe vibrating with the departure of so many souls. Each soul, whether it was a virtuous one or one that had been led astray, was caught in the same cycle, bound by the inevitable truth that no being, no matter how mighty or fallen, could escape the ultimate fate, death. IAS stood there, watching with a mixture of disbelief and growing despair. For all his rage, for all the millions of souls he had manipulated, for all the promises he had made to himself about leading humanity into ruin, he realized, with a sinking feeling in his heart, that he too would not escape. The passage of time had caught up with him. The divine mercy that had once enveloped him was long gone, replaced by a cold, unyielding reality. Even he, the once exalted being, could not avoid the end. He had thought, in his arrogance, that he could outwit fate, that he could shape his own destiny, that his vengeance could carry him beyond the reach of time's relentless march. But now, as he watched soul after soul depart the world, whether they had followed his twisted path or resisted him, he understood something far deeper, far more profound. The world would continue to turn, and every soul would eventually leave it. No one, not even he, could hold on to existence forever. The truth of his own mortality, his own impending doom, hit IAS like a wave crashing upon the shore. He had lived through countless centuries, watched empires rise and fall, seen the world change in ways that only the passing of time could bring. But now, with each passing moment, his own end seemed ever more certain. He had been cast out of Allah's mercy, and now he was nothing more than a shadow of the being he once was. The very essence of his existence, his pride, his defiance, had all led him to this moment of crushing despair. As the souls continued to depart, IAS was forced to confront the one truth he could not escape. He was just like them. Time was running out, and he could not delay it. The endless cycle of vengeance and pride that had fueled him for millennia now seemed meaningless in the face of the ultimate truth. For the first time in his existence, IAS felt the cold hand of fear. It was not a fear of his own demise, not just that, but the realization that he had been blind to the bigger picture all along. He had spent so much time trying to make others falter, to lead them astray, but in doing so, he had lost sight of the fact that his own existence was fleeting, that he too was bound to the same fate as those he had tormented. The despair gripped him with unrelenting force. His once mighty form, full of arrogance and strength, now seemed hollow and weak. The fire that had burned so brightly within him, the fire of pride and defiance, now flickered like a dying ember, unable to escape the inevitable truth. The death he had once defied, the end he had thought he could avoid, was now drawing closer with each passing moment. There was no escaping it. Even IAS, the once proud being, was not immune to the final judgment that awaited all who walked the path of time. The despair deepened, not just because of the inevitable fate awaiting him, but because he realized that all his efforts, all his schemes, had ultimately been in vain. He had tried to corrupt the souls of humankind, to lead them into darkness, to get revenge on Allah for his fall. But now, as he saw the souls of the living pass away, he understood that in the grand scheme of existence, none of it mattered. Time had a way of sweeping away all things, all pride, all arrogance, all rebellion. It was as if his very existence had been a fleeting whisper in the eternal expanse of the universe. And in that moment, IAS was left to face the most profound truth of all. Death was coming for him, just as it came for all. There would be no escape, no more chances, no more manipulations. He was bound by the same law of mortality that had claimed so many before him. His existence, His vengeance had been nothing more than an illusion in the face of time's unyielding flow. As the final souls departed, IAS felt the weight of his own mortality crash down upon him. There was no more fighting, no more resisting. All that was left was the realization that the end was inevitable, and no amount of defiance or pride could change that. His fate was sealed, and he would face it, just as every soul eventually had to. The world had grown still, as if the very air held its breath. For countless millennia, IAS had existed beyond the reach of time and death. He had defied it all, had manipulated countless souls, played the game of vengeance with Allah himself, and believed himself invincible, above the ultimate end. Yet now, standing at the precipice of eternity, the one truth he had always denied loomed before him. The angel of death was coming for him. It was a presence like no other, a force so pure and inevitable that it cast a shadow over the universe. The heavens trembled at its approach, the earth itself seeming to groan beneath the weight of its arrival. The angel of death, whose task it was to sever the souls from their earthly bodies, had come for IAS. His appearance was as terrifying as it was undeniable. A towering figure, clad in a shroud of darkness, with a face that bore no expression but an unyielding finality. In one hand, he gripped a scythe, its blade gleaming with the cold light of the afterlife, ready to claim what was due. IAS, who had once stood among the angels, was now reduced to a trembling figure, consumed by panic. His heart, once filled with unshakable arrogance, now beat in frantic terror. He could feel it. His time had come. The mercy he had once enjoyed was gone, and there was no escape from the inevitable hand of fate. The very thought of the angel of death filled him with a paralyzing fear, unlike anything he had ever known. It was not simply the end of his existence that terrorized him, but the finality of it all, the judgment, the severing of his soul from the world, the cold, unfeeling embrace of the afterlife. In a desperate panic, IAS turned and fled, his mind racing with a single thought: escape. He was no longer the proud, defiant being who had once ruled over the heavens. No, now he was a terrified soul running from the inevitable. His wings, once magnificent and powerful, now felt weak and heavy, as if weighed down by the burden of his sins. He soared through the skies, seeking refuge in the highest mountains, where the winds howled and the peaks pierced the heavens themselves. But even the tallest mountains, those that seemed to scrape the sky, could not protect him. IAS climbed higher and higher, reaching the very tips of the world. But still, the angel of death followed, an unrelenting presence that seemed to be everywhere at once. The higher he went, the more the mountains seemed to close in around him, and the air grew thinner, colder, suffocating him with the weight of his impending doom. In a blind panic, IAS dove into the seas, seeking the deepest, darkest depths where no light could penetrate. The water, dark and cold, enveloped him as he descended, further and further into the abyss. He believed that the depths of the ocean, the vastness of the sea, could shield him from the approaching end. He plunged deeper, past the reefs, past the creatures of the deep, until he was surrounded by nothing but darkness. But no matter how far he descended, no matter how far he ran, the cold presence of the angel of death was always there, just behind him, relentless and inescapable. IAS could feel it, like a weight pressing down on his chest, like a shadow that could not be outrun. The more he tried to flee, the more he realized that no distance, no refuge, no corner of the world could save him. The scythe's blade gleamed in the distance, a silent reminder of what was to come. And then, IAS understood. There was nowhere left to run. The panic that had gripped his heart began to turn into a cold, empty resignation. He was not the mighty being he once was, the being who defied Allah, the being who had manipulated the souls of humankind. Now, he was a soul just like them, bound by the same fate, the same end. The very essence of his existence, his defiance, had led him to this moment, this inescapable moment of reckoning. In the darkness of the ocean, IAS stopped, his wings heavy and battered. The cold, clammy water enveloped him, and the terror began to fade, replaced by a haunting sense of inevitability. There was no escape from this. No pleading, no bargaining, no defiance would change what was to come. The angel of death had come for him, and there was no force in the universe that could delay or deny this fate. As he stood in the abyss, IAS felt a chill more profound than the cold waters surrounding him. It was the chill of finality, the chill of death itself creeping up on him. The scythe was near, and he knew that his time had come. The defiant angel, who had once sought to challenge the Creator, who had once stood proud and untouchable, now found himself at the mercy of the very law of the universe he had sought to escape. And then, with a silent finality, the blade of the scythe came down. The force of it was not just physical. It was the severing of IAS's very existence from the world. The once mighty being who had defied the heavens, who had defiled the sacred law of submission, was now nothing more than a soul, detached from the world of the living. The angel of death had claimed him, just as he had claimed countless others before him. In that moment, IAS's existence was consumed by the darkness. The end had come, and there was no escape. The angel of death had fulfilled his purpose, and IAS had met his fate, not with the defiance he had once shown, but with the cold, quiet resignation of one who could not outrun time, death, or the laws of the universe. The heavens themselves seemed to recoil as IAS, once a mighty being among the angels, was dragged away in agony. The very air quivered with the weight of his torment, as if the universe itself could not bear witness to the suffering of one who had once stood so high, so proud. But now, he was nothing more than a broken, trembling figure, consumed by the unbearable pain of his fate. It was not a peaceful end. There would be no quiet slipping into the void. No, IAS's soul was torn asunder, writhing in agony as the weight of his sins and his pride were ripped from him, piece by piece. As the angels descended upon him, their presence was overwhelming, each one carrying the divine authority of Allah's will. They came not in mercy, but in wrath, for IAS had defied them all. The once glorious being who had turned away from Allah's command, who had rebelled against the very nature of submission, was now facing the consequences of his defiance. They descended from the heavens like a storm of justice, their wings vast and their eyes filled with an unyielding purpose. There was no forgiveness here, no compassion, only the cold, unrelenting power of divine punishment. IAS screamed, a sound more primal than any he had ever made. His body, once so powerful, now writhed in pain, as if his very essence was being torn from him. His wings, which had once spread across the heavens in pride, were now bound and shattered, unable to protect him. Each strike from the angels was a reminder of the arrogance he had embraced, the pride that had led him to this moment. The more he tried to resist, the more the pain intensified, as if his own soul was being ripped apart by an unseen force. It was not a death like any other. It was the unraveling of everything he had been. His very being was pulled from the fabric of existence, piece by piece. The agony was beyond description, a torment that reached deep into the core of his soul, tearing apart the very essence of who he was. The darkness of his sins, the weight of his pride, and the rage he had carried for eons, all of it was being ripped away, leaving nothing but the raw, unshackled pain of his fate. His cries echoed through the void, but there was no one to hear, no one to offer comfort. He had once been the one to lead, to command, but now he was nothing more than a broken soul, lost and alone. The angels held him firm, their hands not filled with malice, but with the inevitable justice of divine will. They did not need to speak. Their very presence told him everything he had failed to understand for so long, that no one could escape the consequences of their actions, not even him. The pain of it was unbearable, and yet it continued, relentless, unyielding. IAS could feel his very soul being torn from him, shredded by the divine retribution that had been set in motion the moment he defied Allah's command. Each moment felt like an eternity, each shred of his being slipping further away from him, taking with it the power, the pride, and the arrogance that had once defined him. And then, as if the heavens themselves could not bear to witness the scene any longer, a great blinding light descended upon him. It was the light of justice, the final punishment for one who had dared to challenge the Creator. IAS felt the overwhelming force of the light, but it was not a comforting light. It was the light of doom. It was a force that consumed him, a light that burned away the very last remnants of his pride, his arrogance, and his identity. As his soul was torn from him, the angels did not leave. They remained, watching over the scene with solemn expressions. For them, this was not a moment of joy, but a necessary fulfillment of divine law. Their duty was to uphold the balance of the universe, and IAS had upset that balance with his defiance. Now, they were the instruments of Allah's wrath, delivering the justice that had been earned by eons of sin. The followers of IAS, the ones who had once stood with him, now watched in horror, unable to comprehend the fate that had befallen their former leader. They had once been loyal to him, led by his charisma and his false promises of power. But now, they were left only with the bitter taste of betrayal, the realization that they had been misled, that they had been followers of a being consumed by pride and vengeance. In their eyes, there was not anger, but fear. They could see the truth now, the truth they had ignored for so long. IAS, their leader, their guide, was no longer the powerful figure they had once followed. He was now nothing more than a broken soul, consumed by the very forces he had tried to control. The fear that gripped them was not just for themselves, but for what they had become in following him. Some fell to their knees, overwhelmed by the realization of the lies they had believed. Others simply stood, paralyzed by the horror of what they had witnessed. The angels, having fulfilled their divine purpose, turned away, leaving the fallen followers to face the consequences of their own choices. They too would face judgment, but not now. For now, the weight of the moment lay with IAS, whose torment had sealed his fate in ways that could never be undone. The scene was one of profound sorrow, a sorrow that transcended even the pain of IAS's torment. It was the sorrow of lost hope, of broken faith, of the realization that even the mightiest can fall. His pride, once so powerful, had led him to this end, a broken soul, dragged through the agony of his own making, surrounded by the cold justice of the heavens. As the angels disappeared into the heavens, the sky grew silent, and all that remained was the echo of IAS's cries. a reminder of what happens when one dares to defy the natural order of the universe. And in that silence, the weight of his fate hung heavy, a warning to all who would follow in his footsteps. IAS, once the pride of the heavenly realm, the being who had once stood among the angels as a beacon of power and wisdom, was now nothing but a broken soul, dragged by divine wrath into the darkest depths of existence. The judgment that had been foretold, the punishment he had sought to avoid for so long, had finally arrived. There would be no mercy, no reprieve, no second chances. His defiance of Allah, his arrogance and his pride had led him to this moment, and now there was no escape from the eternal retribution that awaited him. The heat of the inferno loomed before him, an unrelenting, scorching wall of fire that seemed to stretch into infinity. The very air around him crackled with a palpable intensity, as if the flames themselves were alive, eager to consume him. IAS could feel the heat radiating toward him, but he had no strength left to fight, no wings left to carry him away. His body, once so powerful and full of defiance, now felt weak, as if it had been drained of its essence. His soul, torn and ravaged by the judgment he had received, seemed to tremble at the thought of the flames that awaited him. As he was thrust into the blazing abyss, the fires of hell consumed him with a force that tore through his very being. The pain was unimaginable, unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was not just the searing heat that burned his skin, nor the acrid smoke that filled his lungs. It was the unbearable agony that reached deep into the core of his soul, pulling at the very fabric of his existence. The fire was not just a physical torment. It was the ultimate symbol of his eternal punishment, the divine retribution for the pride that had blinded him to the truth. He screamed in agony, in terror, in the realization that there was no end to this suffering. But there was no one to hear his cries. No angel would come to his aid. No being would pity him. His cries were swallowed by the unrelenting fire, a futile echo in the vast, endless chasm of hell. Every flame that licked at his body was a reminder of his choices, a reminder of the arrogance that had led him to this point. And with every moment, the pain seemed to intensify, as if the flames were alive with vengeance, seeking to repay him for the defiance, the betrayal, and the pride that had shaped his entire existence. But IAS's torment did not end there. As his body writhed in the fire, there came the rejection from the very gates of heaven, those gates he had once believed he would stand at the forefront of. He had been one of the exalted beings, a creation of fire, a being who had once been so close to the divine light. But now, he stood at the threshold of the eternal kingdom, only to find the gates locked, the divine presence beyond them unreachable. He was not welcomed. He was not wanted. The mercy of Allah, once so near, was now a distant memory, and he was no longer worthy to even approach the gates that had once been his birthright. The sight of the gates, so close yet so far, filled IAS with a crushing despair. His pride, once the force that had driven him to challenge the very Creator, had now left him with nothing but emptiness. There was no hope of redemption, no promise of forgiveness. His soul, broken and torn, was now bound to the flames of hell forever. His punishment was not a brief moment of agony. It was the endless, unyielding torment of a being who had been consumed by pride and who had rejected the very mercy that could have saved him. As IAS burned in the eternal fire, his mind raced, but it was too late. There were no more plans, no more schemes, no more acts of rebellion. All that remained was the unrelenting suffering, a never-ending cycle of pain, that seemed to stretch into eternity. He had been the one who thought himself above all others, the one who believed that no punishment, no consequence could ever reach him. And now, he was nothing more than a hollow soul, lost in the flames of his own making. Every moment, every second in the fire felt like an eternity. The torment never ceased, the flames never dimmed. IAS was condemned to endure the consequences of his actions for all eternity. The fire was not just a punishment, it was a symbol of his own arrogance, a reminder of the pride that had brought him to this place. The fire would never stop burning, and neither would his suffering. And so, IAS, once the most exalted, the most beautiful, the most powerful of all beings, was left to burn in the inferno, forever separated from the mercy he had once known, forever rejected by the gates of heaven. His defiance, his pride, and his refusal to submit had sealed his fate. There would be no end to his pain, no release from his torment, no hope for redemption. In that eternal fire, IAS was left with nothing but the stark, crushing truth. He had fallen from grace, and now he would remain in the depths of hell forever, an eternal reminder of the cost of arrogance. The pride that had once defined him now consumed him as he became nothing more than a shadow of his former self, lost in the endless flames, forever locked in the torment he had earned. The flames of hell burned on, a ceaseless reminder of the fate of the most arrogant being to ever exist. And in the midst of that eternal fire, IAS's soul was lost, forever forsaken, forever in pain, nothing more than a cautionary tale for all who would follow in his footsteps. IAS, once the most exalted among the angels, fell from grace due to his pride and defiance. His journey from arrogance to eternal suffering serves as a stark reminder that no being, no matter how powerful, can escape the consequences of pride and disobedience. His refusal to bow, his rejection of divine will, led him to a fate of eternal torment. The lesson is clear. Arrogance and disobedience only lead to destruction.